For some reason, I don't know why. I'm hoping you guys can hear me okay. I'm having a little bit of an audio issue this morning. Seems like my audio is very quiet and I'm not sure why. So let me know if there's any sort of, oh, hold on. Let me know if there's any issues. In fact, give me 1 second here. I'm just gonna try something. Can you guys hear me okay now? Okay, any difference? No, okay. I think that corrected it a little bit on my side, so hopefully that'll work moving forward. Let me know if anything goes weird there. Cool, well, let's go ahead and jump into it here. We are in week 5 and cruising along here in the graphic design layout. A couple things I wanted to go over quickly this morning. We do have a new module that we're going to be working on this week. We're going to be introducing typography and starting to experiment with some typographic forms, creating some compositions using a quote that you guys will pull and sort of explore some different compositions within this typographic exploration we're going to be doing. It's a pretty fun little assignment. Kind of ties in a little bit of an expansion to the sort of top 10 lists that we worked with and that idea of formatting type to create that hierarchy. This is done in a little bit more of a experimental way. So we'll take a look at that. It's a pretty fun little assignment. One thing I wanted to just mention was I was looking back at the top 10 list, that last assignment that was due this Sunday, and I did see that there were several missing assignments that came in. So if you are one of those individuals who did not get that top 10 list in this last Sunday, please work to get that submitted ASAP. I can still give you partial credit for that, but I do deduct points for being late, and I continue to deduct points for the later that it is. So the sooner that you can get it in, the more points you'll be able to receive for that assignment. Not totally sure what happened there. I know there's been a few issues with Adobe and things like that, but been working with those students individually. So if that's not the issue, if it's not the Adobe and for whatever reason you just weren't able to get that in, let me know if you're having some sort of problems with that. If you have some sort of questions, I'm more than happy to either set up another appointment, another meeting where we could talk about that a little bit further and troubleshoot some things, or correspond through email and video recordings, something like that. So I know that's a little tougher assignment as far as getting into InDesign and working with several different aspects of that. So it can be kind of challenging. But regardless, if you are not able to get that in or complete that, please do so ASAP. And if you're having any problems with it, let me know so we can troubleshoot that. This is an important lesson that it's, all these build upon each other. So we need to have a clear understanding of each one of these different aspects of InDesign, layout, hierarchy, so on and so forth. So if you have something that you need to reach out for me, go ahead and do that individually. If you'd like, you can drop me something in the chat and an email, and I'll be going through and grading those here shortly. Did anybody have any questions right now that they wanted to bring up on that assignment? Any issues that they want to address at this time? Okay. All right, well, if that's the case, we'll go ahead and move on, but please, again, work to get those submitted if you have not, okay? But moving forward, we do have a couple different things that I wanted to touch base on. The first thing was a graphic design club. So you guys should have received this announcement. I know it kind of came through randomly last week. and I know it's kind of late in the semester as well, we have had a graphic design club here on campus over the last, 3 semesters, I believe. It's a small club, and it's kind of been difficult to kind of keep it going as far as these officer positions and things like that. But I would like to try to get something together for it this semester. And if you guys are interested, I would encourage you guys to sign up. The reason that I'm kind of jumping on this a little bit more than I was previously is because there has come up some opportunities here to collaborate with AIGA, which is an association, a national association, let's see here, of designers. And there is a San Diego, oops, let me share my screen. Sorry, I forgot I wasn't sharing my screen. And there is a San Diego chapter of that as well. Can you guys all see that? That is potentially going to kind of be able to link with this club. So basically through this AIGA, I'll drop it in the chat here as well. You guys can check it out. There's going to be some different workshops and things like that that are going to be happening. And one of those is going to be probably happening in April, in the beginning of April. It's an event that I've been a part of in the past called Unite, where they basically get together different colleges, different groups of graphic designers. They do different workshops, anything from screen printing to photographing your artwork. I've taught a few workshops on illustration and like adding textures to your illustrations and things like that. So there's could be some really cool opportunities coming up this semester, and it's kind of something where everybody's just rallying together to try to make it happen. So it's happening quickly, and I would love to be a part of it, and I would love for you guys to be a part of it too. So I'm trying to tie in this graphic design club to this, as far as some of these workshops and things like that that are going to be coming through. This again is the link to the AIGA site here that is national, and then again there's a San Diego chapter of that as well. But there is no cost to the graphic design club. It's a simple sort of sign up that you guys would do. There's a link to it right here at the very bottom. The thing that needs to happen in order to make this club work is we do need to have at least 10 members inside the club and at least 5 officers. So there is some details about those officer positions here. It looks a little scary if you click into that. There's a lot of details about each officer position, so on and so forth. But I assure you, it's not as daunting as it seems, and I'm there to help with the process as well. So that's kind of what's going on with that. I'd like to, get as many people interested as possible, and if there are enough people interested and enough officers that are willing to take on some of the responsibilities to help get the club going, then we can hopefully make this happen and be a part of some of these larger events that are happening within the design community here and in San Diego. And the other cool thing about this is we'd be partnering with San Diego City College, San Diego State, Palomar, a lot of the other schools, essentially, Point Loma Nazarene. And these would be workshops and things like that where instructors, other students from those schools are going to be there. And the whole idea of this is to collaborate with those students, collaborate with those other instructors. So for those of you who are potentially thinking about transferring and being a graphic design major, it's a great kind of segue, great way to get your foot in the door to meet some of those individuals, see what they're doing, within their programs over there, and start to kind of bridge that gap within your individual pathways and what have you. So yeah, so I encourage you guys to check that out. Again, at the very bottom is the sign up sheet for that. If you click into that, just goes over a couple questions where you'll fill out your name, student ID, email, and it will ask you about those club officer positions. And within that same announcement there, a little further up is the sort of breakdown of all those roles of those officer positions. So if you have any interest in that, if you have any questions in that, let me know. I'd like to stir up a little bit of involvement and start to plan for these monthly meetings which would happen the first Thursday of every month, in addition to some of these other events and things like that that are going to be going on. So great thing to put on your resume. Great way to get a little bit more involved in the community of design. I know a lot of you guys are just getting into graphic design. You may not even be graphic design majors, but that's okay as well. It's a good way to start networking within the community there. So I encourage you guys to check that out. Any questions on that right now? Anybody have any comments? Okay. All right. If anybody has any questions on that, let me know. Again, I hope to see some of you guys sign up for that, and hopefully we can get that up off the ground here before the end of the semester. Oops. Back here. Okay, well, let's jump into the latest announcement. Pretty short and sweet. Jumping into what we're doing this week, which is again working on the typography assignment. We're going to be exploring type formatting and layout. There's a new module that's open, which we'll take a look at here shortly. I have 2 different lectures to cover today that we'll go over and take a little break in between, and then go over the actual assignment as well and take a look at how we're going to start working on that in the software. So below here is the task list for the week, looking at the typography learning module, which we'll do here shortly. There's also some readings for this week that are not out of the textbook. They're direct links to third-party websites. The first one is What is Typography here by Peter Block. So it's pretty short, pretty sweet. Great little write-up here, kind of looking at the concept of typography in a more grander sort of picture, really, versus like individual typefaces and things like that. Really, really interesting article there. And then the next one is A Guide to Type Styles by Krista Radova. And this really kind of dives a little bit more into the specifics of typography, the differences between these different typographic styles that we're going to start to look at today, and really that you should start to be familiarizing yourself with as a designer as well. So it kind of goes over some of these basics to start to familiarize yourself with. So 2 different articles there to check out. Make sure that you are staying on top of both of those, and also working on the assignment for this week, which will be tied into this typography. It will be this is another week-long module. So we'll be working throughout this week and submitting that to the assignment section by this Sunday, and dropping the final design file in here. We'll take a look at exactly what that's going to look like after the lecture, and kind of dive into how we're going to finalize that. But that is the idea there. Okay. So you guys can always check back here at that task list. Make sure to click into those links to get those readings done here this week as well. And I will go ahead and hop over here to the module. We'll just take a look at this. I opened up that typography module there. So you can see we have both the readings listed up here at the top. We have the assignment sheet, the font pack, which is what we're going to be using to access the particular fonts here for this project that are found in Adobe Fonts, some previous projects down here, and then a PDF of the lecture that you can refer back to. So we'll dive into this after the lecture and kind of dive in and look at the details of all that assignment and everything. Okay. Anybody have any questions right now before we get into it? Okay. Well, I always like this lecture a lot, and I love typography in general. It's always something that has been very appealing to me as a designer, and I think it's something that often gets kind of overlooked sometimes within the design world. And so I think this is a great little module here. So I hope you guys find something out of it here as well. Just to kind of heads up, there is a full typography class. ART160 is, which we're teaching this semester. It's offered every other semester, but it is within the structure there of the programs, obviously within the graphic design structure there. So it's a full class dedicated to typography. So we are like simply kind of scratching the surface here with this assignment, just kind of really looking at some of the basics and thinking about how we can utilize typography because we are dealing with layout, in this particular class, it's important to be able to be familiar with typography and really just start to familiarize yourself with the details and the intricacies of some of these different typefaces and styles within those typefaces, and also start to familiarize yourself with the formatting of text, which again ties into that top 10 list from this last week, right? Where you guys are creating that hierarchy and you're really starting to take this bulk text and group it into different areas of again hierarchy, and use different typographic treatments to kind of explore how you can create those points of emphasis, so on and so forth. So we're going to talk about, let me organize this. We're going to talk about typefaces here, and we're going to talk about a little bit what a typeface is versus a font, because we throw around these terms a lot, right? A lot of times outside of the design world, we refer to, text and things like that as fonts. And then when we start getting into design, we start hearing about these terms of typography and things like that. So what do you guys think, without necessarily having any knowledge of this, does anybody have any ideas on what the difference is between a typeface and a font? Any thoughts? Christine, yeah, go ahead.
I'm thinking a typeface is like like if it involves serifs or not, and a font is like a different style like of typing.
You're on the right track there. What you started to talk about there, Christine, with the idea of typefaces and serifs and sans serifs and things like that. That is along the right idea. And really, when we're talking about these two different things, it is important to be able to create a distinction between the two. And the best way to think about this is, typography is essentially defined as the theory in the practice of letter and typeface design. So a typeface is the collective name of a family of related fonts. So for example, let's think of something like Times New Roman, which we've all used in the past, even if you've used a word processing system like Microsoft Word or something like that, right? Times New Roman is a typeface. It's sort of the family of what this looks like, what these letter forms look like. And within that typeface of Times New Roman are individual fonts, such as Times New Roman Italic or Times New Roman Bold, so on and so forth, right? We've all used those, and we use that in the last assignment as well to create that sense of hierarchy and things like that. So when we're talking about typefaces, we're really talking about the overall design and structure of a larger sort of umbrella of what these individual fonts look like. So again, referring back to the Times New Roman, that would be the typeface. And then the fonts would constitute the actual weights of those typefaces, the widths of them, whether they're really skinny or whether they're extended. And those would be things like italic and bold, condensed, extended, so on and so forth. So you can really think about that as sort of typography, or the typeface being the umbrella and the fonts being the individual components underneath that umbrella. Does that make sense? And this is something that you should practice when you're talking within design, the correct terminology, because it shows that you have some sort of understanding of the difference of these. And it's also going to be important as you get into your career within graphic design to be able to specify between these and be able to articulate that appropriately. So we're looking at this as an example here of the typeface of Roboto, right? And this is actually a sans serif typeface that we can see over here on the left. And the typeface is Roboto. That's sort of the umbrella of that typeface. Within that typeface are the different fonts available, those different sort of styles of that particular typeface, whether it's thin, light, regular, medium, bold, and black, like we can see here. So when you are referring to a font that you're using within your design, you're referring to something that is very specific. You're not referring to just the entire typeface itself. You're referring to a specific style of that typeface. You might be referring to a bold version of that typeface or a light version of that typeface, right? So those fonts are a little bit more specified than the actual typographic form itself. And really with typography, we're thinking again about the design of art and technique of arranging letter forms. It's at the center of a designer's skill set, and it's about more than just simply making words legible, right? We can see from an example here that it has to do with our own sort of relationship to these letter forms, that we can start to articulate and find shapes that reinforce these letter forms, even within elements around us. We can see an example here where they're taking different fruits and sort of slicing them to create this word juicy that's almost working on these different scales, if you will, right? So we almost have like this typeface of fruit font or of fruits, and then the fonts are like these varying sort of types of the fruits that we can see within that. And that has to do with our recognition of letter forms. So we can get sort of experimental with things within our typography based on that sort of recognition that we have of these letter forms. So the typeface that you choose and how it works with your overall layout, the overall grid structure, the color scheme that you're using, and so on, is going to make a big difference between a good and a bad design. And it's important to start to consider what typeface is going to best support the different designs that you're working on, because typefaces have different sort of connotations to them as well. They can create a different mood and a different experience for the viewer. And that can help you as a designer if you're choosing the right typeface, or it can hurt you as well. So you want to start to be versatile and be able to experiment with these. So we looked at the difference between a typeface and a font. And there are also different styles within typefaces themselves, right? The first one we want to look at is serif fonts versus sans serif fonts. These are probably two of the more popular styles that you're going to be dealing with as a designer. And it's really, really important to understand the difference and be able to start to see these. So when we're thinking about serif and sans serif fonts, the biggest difference is that serif typefaces are going to have that sort of bracket at the end of the terminal of the letter forms, right? We can see this happening over here on the right-hand side. We can see that we have these terminals that are working on all these letter forms, and at the end, or excuse me, these stems or strokes. And at the end of those, we can see these different terminals here, which have these sort of bracketed serifs that literally kind of work off of the letter forms. And over here on the left, we can see a version of a sans serif typeface, right? And sans serif literally means without serif. Sans means without in French. So it's a direct, terminology of what you're seeing here. But what we're seeing is that at the end of all these terminals here, there are none of those serifs at the end of the brackets, right? They just sort of shut off at the end of the stem or at the stroke there that we're seeing. And this is a huge distinction that we want to be able to make. And a lot of times there are, bigger distinctions within them as well. One thing to take a look at here is that a sans serif typeface is typically considered a little bit more modern. It's also a little bit more universal as far as the sort of weights that are happening here between the letter forms, right? So the serif font is a little bit more ornamental, where the serifs have these sort of extending ornamental elements that are coming off of the ends, while the sans serifs are very clean. They're very precise within their overall look and feel that we can see. And both of these styles have their own unique sort of personality, and they kind of can communicate different messages. That's why it's important to understand that each style that you're going to be using aligns with the message that you want to have for that particular design. So one thing you should definitely be taking note of is starting to identify whether a typeface is a serif typeface. Over here on the right, it has those sort of serifs coming off of the brackets, or if it's a sans serif typeface, if it is removed of any of those brackets that we can see. Today, we see a lot of serif fonts in traditional mediums, such as newspapers, things like magazines, books. And that's why serif fonts are typically seen as a little bit more classical. They're a little bit more refined, and they may be used by companies who want to sort of exude these sort of traits as well, right? As mentioned above, the most notable characteristic of these serif typefaces is that decorative sort of tail, or these different strokes that are coming off of these letter forms. So these serif letters, they commonly use these strokes that sort of vary in weight, meaning some areas of the letter may be a little thicker and some areas of the letter may be a little bit thinner, right? We can see that happening in almost all of these examples here. If we look at some of these capital letters here, we can see that the G in Georgia gets very sort of thin up at the top, and then it gets much thicker over on the side. The width of this stroke is sort of varying in size, right? Same thing over here with Baskerville, where we can see that the stems of the B are very thick, but they're very, very thin contrasting counters that sort of move around that capital B there. So typically when you're dealing with these serif typefaces, you're going to have a little bit more of that sort of contrast within the thick and the thin of those lines. And you can see that that's in contrast here to these sans serif typefaces, right? These are a little bit more universal as far as the thick and the thins that are used between the actual letter forms themselves. When we look at a typeface like Helvetica up here, almost all of the different stems in the strokes are the same width, right? The L is the same width as the sort of strokes on the H over here, which is the same as the C, which we saw some huge sort of varying in width there with the serif typeface. So not only are we adding in, or removing, I should say, these serifs, but we're also kind of looking at a little bit more of a universal width to these overall typefaces here and the look of those. So while serif fonts focus really on embracing a little bit more of tradition, a little bit more history, sans serifs take a little bit more of a simplistic, a little bit more of a modern look and feel. So you can see that between those two different styles, a serif and a sans serif typeface, that may appeal to whatever sort of design that you're working on at the time. If you're going for something that might feel a little, that you might want to exude a little bit more simplicity, modernism, minimalism, then a sans serif typeface would probably be a good solution for that. If you're trying to communicate something that has a little bit more tradition to it, that might have a little bit more elegance to it, might have a little bit more decorative qualities, then a serif typeface would probably be a good example of that as well. And you can see in all of these examples here, Helvetica, Open Sans, Proxima Nova, and Arial. These are all popular sans serif typefaces, and they all have these clean, very crisp lines of these sans serifs. And many of these are used for web design as well. We see that typically sans serif typefaces are going to show a little better on screen than serif typefaces. This has actually come a long way, but through the use of advances of technology and what have you. But certainly when the computer first came around, they had to essentially recreate some of these typefaces, and the sans serif typeface became very popular because of that simplicity and that easy readability on screen that we could see. So before I move on from that, is there any questions here on a serif and a sans serif typeface, the difference between those two? There should be a clear understanding of that. And really it's in the typeface itself. As soon as you look at that typeface, if it has some sort of brackets at the end of those terminals, then it's a serif typeface. If it doesn't, then it's typically going to be a sans serif typeface. And there are multiple subcategories and variations within those different styles. We're actually going to look at those in the next lecture here, but those two big differences are something that should be very obvious in the beginning. In addition to that, there's different parts of the letters themselves, and we dive into this a little bit more in typography and start to familiarize ourselves with the terminology. But there's essentially anatomy to typography, and it is important to understand as you continue with your design education the sort of intricacies and the terminology so that you can speak about these different things within your own designs and also make these educated decisions. We're not going to go into that too much within this particular practice, but I did want to make note that there are specific terms for the different parts of these typefaces and letter forms. And again, we cover that in more detail in the typography course itself. But one thing that we can play with here is size, right? The scale of typefaces. They're not always created equal. Some typefaces are going to be kind of fat and wide. Some are going to kind of be thin and narrow. So the typeface that we choose might, or I should actually say the layout that we have or the design that we have might depict the type of type choice that we're going to choose, right? If you have a limited amount of space, you might want to choose a typeface that is going to accommodate that space or be able to fit a lot of words inside there. If you have a very skinny but tall area that you want to fill, you might want to choose a specific typeface that is going to work within that specific area. So the size of typefaces can sometimes come into play within the different amount of space that you have to work with. And it also comes into play with the hierarchy. We looked at this last week, right? Scale is a huge way to create that emphasis and those focal points within your design. And when we're talking about scale, the most common method used to measure type is going to be the point system. And this dates back to the 18th century. So 1 point is actually 172 inches, and 12 points makes up 1 pica. You don't really need to know that at this particular time. I'm not going to quiz you on that. But what I do want you to realize is that there are different point sizes that work differently. Typically, when we're thinking about body text or something that's going to have a lot of text inside of it, you're going to be working anywhere between a 6-point typeface to roughly maybe a 12-point typeface, right? That's going to be anywhere from something not too small to where we can't read it, but also not too big to where it's going to take up so much space for a larger area of content. And once you start getting into the larger type sizes, or point sizes, I should say, 14 and above, we start getting into more what we refer to as a display type size, meaning that's going to be your sort of header. It's going to be your sort of title of the piece, right? So you typically do not want to go any smaller than a 6-point typeface in any of your body copy. This is going to make it too hard for individuals to read, and it is also not going to print very well. The sort of DPI, or the digital pixels per inch, will not necessarily work that well with most typefaces that are set at 5-point. So you should almost always be working with 5-point or above. But you can see that there are sort of general sizing for a lot of those. And again, you want to be sure that you understand that that point refers to the actual size itself. And we can see all those different variations here. So we're playing with size, and that's one thing we're going to be exploring within this particular project this week. The other thing that we're going to look at here are some elements within type formatting itself, which is kerning. So the kerning is going to be the space between two individual letters. So this is used when you need to pull only one letter because it is maybe too far or too close to some of its companions. And we could see that here for the words letters L-A-V, right? So typically when we are typing out letters within a particular typeface, they're going to have a default spacing between each one of those letter forms, right? When that typeface was created, they basically took that letter form and made a default spacing that it should have between the letter forms that are going to come next to it. But sometimes different letter forms can look awkward, and that spacing can seem irrational when we're looking at it at a larger scale. So let's take an example here. Let's look at over here on the left. This is a sans serif typeface with the capital letters L-A-V written out, right? If we were to just write this out using the standard typeface, using the standard word processing, the spacing between that A and that V is very, very large in comparison to the space between the L and the A, right? And we can kind of think about this as almost putting this invisible box around each one of these letters. If you think about the L sort of being a larger rectangle and then the A kind of being a square, really they're placing them right next to each other. But because the A has this long stem that's moving in this direction, and the V has this other stem that's moving in this direction, it just creates this large gap. Even though if we, again, put those invisible boxes, they're sitting next to each other, it sort of creates that weird distance there. So kerning is going to be when you look at those individual spaces between the individual letters and make adjustments to those. So over here on the right, we can see that by pulling in the actual V closer to that letter, capital letter A, it feels a little bit more appropriate. You can still read it very well, and the spacing seems a little bit easier to, more effective for those particular letter forms. So kerning has to do with the space between individual letter forms. And really, this is more a focus when you're working with headlines or display fonts, where you're going to be looking at something very large. When you get into body copy, you're not really concerning yourself too much with the individual spacing of between the letter forms themselves. But when it blows up and it becomes very big, it's much more obvious. And that is something to take into consideration. So kerning is the spacing between the actual letter forms themselves, again, typically used for a large display fonts. Now, in addition to that, we have tracking. And this is the actual spacing between all the letter forms in the body of text. So being able to change the tracking helps to fit more letters in smaller spaces, or it can actually spread out the letter forms if they're too tight together. So instead of looking at kerning, which is the spacing between the individuals, we're looking at tracking, which is the spacing between the whole word or the whole line of text itself, right? Now, this is much more obvious because you're going to be affecting the entirety of all the text that's being shown. And you can imagine if you had, multiple columns of text and you adjust the tracking, it's either going to take up more space or it's going to potentially save you space depending on how you're working with that. So that's going to be something to play with here as well within this assignment, this tracking or the spacing between the overall word itself. We're actually looking at a script typeface here, which is kind of reminiscent of a handwriting style, right? And tracking is often really effective within these sort of script typefaces because it really makes it feel like these letter forms are connected together instead of having them sort of separated and realizing that they're all these individual letter forms. When we decrease that tracking or tighten up that tracking, it creates these stronger ligatures, these stronger connections that are intended for this actual typeface to make it look like these letter forms are moving smoothly from one to the next there. So you can see how that is very useful, especially for these script fonts. Nayeli, do you have a question?
Yes, this last typeface you showed us is considered sans serif, or it's not in that category?
Yeah, that's a great question, Nayeli. This would not be considered a serif or a sans serif necessarily. This is a different style that we would refer to as a script font. So script fonts are typically going to be, again, more reminiscent of kind of like a handwriting style or calligraphy style. And in the next lecture, we're actually going to look at some additional styles here of typefaces. But that's a great question. Sans serif and serif are two different styles, but there are multiple styles that we're going to continue to look at here.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. So we looked at the kerning, spacing between the individual letters. We looked at that tracking, which is the spacing between the letters in an overall word or an overall line of text. Next, we're going to look at our leading here. So the leading is essentially the space between the baselines. It's essentially going to be your line length, right? Or the distance between each line of text. So this means that when we manipulate the leading, we are changing the way a paragraph is essentially going to look. If we have really tight leading, if all the lines of text are very close together, it's going to be very condensed. It can sometimes be a little difficult to read, where if we increase that leading, if we spread that out a little bit, it's giving us more space for our eyes, right? To really kind of move through this text. It makes it much easier to read and a little bit gentler on the eyes, but it's taking up more physical space on the design as well. So there's a balance to be had there, right? Sometimes you want to increase that leading a lot to draw attention in. Sometimes you need to keep that leading really tight because you have a lot of content that you're going to need to fill into that space. So the tighter you keep that leading, the more you're going to be able to fit inside there. So the leading is really the spacing between the individual lines of text. And we can see how that affects the overall density of the area of text on the page as well, right? It becomes kind of darker over here on the left, not only because it's in a gray box, but because each one of those lines of text is so closer together, it almost becomes a tighter sort of rectangle shape, where this one being spread out creates that more of that airiness to it, more of that sort of positive and negative space relationship where you're working through the different lines of text. That is going to be referred to as the leading there. And the reason it's called the leading, just to kind of give you guys a head up, is that's really pulled from the way that typography used to be created for letter pressing and for actual printmaking itself, right? They would actually use strips of lead between the different lines of text to separate them. And they had thicker pieces of lead if they wanted to create more spacing, or thinner pieces of lead if they wanted a really tight spacing inside there. So that terminology for leading actually comes from the terminology that was used in that original print pressing that was used, in the 18th and 19th century there. And that's kind of the case for a lot of terminology for font design and typefaces as well. A lot of the terminology is borrowed from some of these practices that came from the really 16th through the 18th century practices of typography and experimentation that came with that. So it's kind of interesting to see that tie in. And we do dive into that a little bit further in ART160 typography as well. But looking at this, are there any questions right now? Really, the biggest thing I want you to pull from this particular lecture here is the difference between a typeface, which again is really the umbrella, and then the individual fonts that are found within that umbrella. So for example, the typeface of Helvetica, and then looking at Helvetica light and bold as the actual fonts. And then also starting to articulate the difference between the serif and sans serif typefaces, which are going to have those brackets at the end. You can always remember that sans means without. So when you think about sans serif, you're thinking about without the serif. You can kind of substitute that in your mind. And then the, the three big things that we looked at here were the kerning, the tracking, and the leading of this sentence structure and these word structures to create that different density on the page, make it easier to read or create more or less space within your actual layout there as well. So within those different practices, that's really what we're going to be utilizing this week for our typography assignment here. So for this assignment, you're going to be looking at the ability as a designer to change the appearance of text by modifying the leading, the tracking, the size, and the typeface itself. We're able to make the exact same words or statement look completely different. And this comes partly from the change of density on the page, how much text, how much figure ground relationship is on there, and the diversity in the text, which affects the overall sort of color, if you will, of the design. And that can have a large impact on how the design is actually, how the text is read and how it's perceived. So your job is going to be to choose a quote, and you can start to think about this a little bit. Choose a quote that means something to you and is expressive. And we're going to be making at least 4 typographic layouts that follow these given guidelines that are found in the typeface module. So we are going to be using specific typefaces that are found on Adobe Fonts. We'll take a look at those here shortly and reference those. There is no template for this assignment, so you guys are going to be creating your own document here. You're going to be using 8.5 by 11 page with an 8-inch by 8-inch composition square inside of there. And you're going to set that up with bleed and crop marks, and using these typographic elements, you're going to use the same quote that you choose. It's going to be up to you what you want to pick for each one of these 4 different layouts. And you're going to be choosing typefaces according to the content of your quote, which best describes what it is that you're trying to express through the meaning of that specific quote itself. So one of the first things you're going to want to do is research and find a quote that you may want to use. and really analyze the words within it for the meaning. See how you might be able to pull some emphasis out of the design, or potentially play with different styles of typography that might sort of reference a specific voice that you're going for within that quote. So examine the sort of sentence structure, how that actual quote is read. Think about which words are the most important and determine some sort of interesting hierarchy within that sentence structure. You're going to explore the tone, the mood, the flow of this, of your quote, and think about where you would want to take a breath while you're reading, and what parts of the quote may want to be said more softly, or may want to kind of be said more loudly, right? Thinking about how to draw emphasis to different parts of that quote. How will the white space in the composition be used? So again, thinking in the overall composition, how are you going to place your typography to work within that layout? And then overall, your explorations should add life to the dimension of the text themselves. So it's the reason I let you guys choose your own quote here is that hopefully you'll choose something that is kind of meaningful to you, that has something, or you have some sort of relationship to it. And I really want you to kind of interpret the meaning of this text and think about how you can show this in a variety of ways, using the same quote for each one of these layouts, showing a different sort of use of hierarchy, scale, so on and so forth, utilizing these typographic forms. Yeah, so that's the end of that. You could also use a quote from a song or something like that, if that appeals to you, or if it's an actual artist quote, or quote from some sort of design, somebody who's inspirational to you in your life. It's really up to you. What I would suggest is choosing something that's not too long, but also not too short. You want to have something that has at least, a couple of sentences inside of it, or at least enough words that you're going to be able to manipulate that space and create some sort of interesting dynamic within those compositions. But if it's too long, it could get kind of cumbersome as well. So anywhere from, two to a few sentences to a few different words that would create that composition can work for this assignment itself. Okay. Are there any questions right now on the lecture here, what we're going over? Christine, you have a question?
Yeah, which Adobe program are we going to be using?
Oops. I'm sorry, Christine, give me 1 second. Like, having this audio issue again, bear with me here. Can you try that again, Christine? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry about it. Which Adobe program are we going to be using?
Yeah, you know what? Let's take a look at that. Let's jump on over to the module here and kind of recap what's going on with this assignment. And then we'll take a little break and we'll go into the additional lecture here, because I think at this point, it's helpful to kind of see what we're working on. And that's a good question. So let's jump into the actual assignment sheet here. So again, for this exercise, you're going to be looking at the ability of the designer to change this exact text in different ways that have different looks and feels to them by adjusting the leading, the tracking, the size, and the actual typefaces that you choose. So choose a quote that means something to you and is expressive, and make at least 4 typographic layouts that follow the given guidelines. You can use from these typefaces down here. And then I also have a link to a font pack that's on Adobe that you guys can reference and use any of the typefaces on there as well. We're going to be creating a page of 8.5 by 11 in InDesign for this assignment. So you are going to be using InDesign for this assignment correctly. Yes. And to answer your question there, Christine. And you're going to be creating that 8.5 by 11 page. And then within that 8.5 by 11 page, you're going to be creating that square composition box that you're going to use to place your actual artwork in. So that 8-inch by 8-inch square composition box should house all of the actual design itself. And you can have things bleed outside of that composition box as well. That doesn't need to be sort of locked in there, but that is really where all of your design elements should sit in that square composition on the 8.5 by 11 page there. We will be working with 0.25 inch margins, bleed and crop marks, which we'll take a look at setting up that document here shortly. You're using only typographic elements, so you're going to use the same quote for each design, choosing typefaces according to the content of your quote. So again, you're going to analyze the quote and find words within it that have some sort of meaning. Think about the structure of that quote, so on and so forth. How can you sort of play up the actual typographic voice and communicate that through these type choices as well? So you're going to have 4 layouts, and each one of these layouts is going to be kind of different. You're going to be opening up different options for you to use as you work through these layouts. So layout number 1 is going to use only one typeface and only one style of that typeface. So again, basically one font within that typeface, right? A bold version, a Roman version, an italic version, etc. You can also only use one size of type, so we're not using scale within this first layout. So you're really going to need to think about the letter spacing, the actual kerning, as well as the tracking of those letters. You're also going to need to think about the line spacing, the leading itself, the space between each one of those lines, and then the overall white space within the composition. How can you create a sense of hierarchy and flow within that composition using only, again, one font within a typeface and one size of that typeface? So choose your typeface and size carefully in relation to the content of the quote and the size of the page. So that's going to be the first layout. We're really restricting ourselves for that particular one. On the second layout, you now can use only one type family, like Helvetica, for example, but you can use all the different styles or the different fonts within that one family. So you can use, italic, you can use bold, you can use condense, so on and so forth. And you can also use up to 3 different type sizes for that. So now you're starting to play with scale for layout number 2. Which will really increase that hierarchy within that space. So we're opening up more options within the typeface. We're opening up some size options in layout number 2 as well. Then in layout number 3, now we're able to bring in an additional typeface. So now we're using 2 typefaces, but only one style or one font within each one of those. And again, you can use 2 different sizes for that one. And then in layout number 4, you can use 2 different typefaces, in any style and in any sizing that you would like. So really the idea here is to kind of create apply some rules to ourselves in the very beginning, start to familiarize ourselves with the sort of text formatting as far as the tracking, the leading, the spacing, and the composition goes, and then start to open ourselves up into different options of styles of typefaces, and then different fonts within those typefaces, different sizing, so on and so forth. Okay. So the info for all those different layouts are right here, and I'll show you guys an example here in just a second as well. This is just an exploration, so have some fun with this. You should end up with 4 pages, because each one of those 8.5 by 11 is going to have the 8-inch by 8-inch composition box. At the end of this, you're going to have 4 pages. Each of those have the same quote. We're not changing the quote on these. The idea behind this is to see how we can deliver this same quote differently within this typographic practice. So create those variations according to the rules of each layout, which was listed above there. And then you're going to export that as one single PDF and post that actually to the assignments, to Canvas there. And that final PDF will have those 4 pages, 1 page with each layout named accordingly. Okay. So this is going to be something to refer back to. I would have this open as you're working on this assignment, so you can refer to these different rules for each layout here. And we can kind of see how those are applied here. We'll jump down to the previous example to kind of show you what we're talking about. So here we can see if I can zoom out, 4 different pages, right? And really we're utilizing one quote, and we're working with those rules, those restrictions that we have on each layout. So in the first layout, you're only able to use 1 different font within a particular typeface, and you're only able to use 1 size. So you really got to think about the structure, the alignment of these elements within the composition, the leading and the tracking. How can you create some differences and hierarchy within that. And again, think about the actual pacing of your quote itself. Here we can read a quote by Michael Beirut, who's a graphic designer and CEO of Pentagram, or actually I should say co-partner of Pentagram Design Agency. And we see here, he reads, most processes leave out the stuff no one wants to talk about. Magic, intuition, and leaps of faith by Michael Beirut. So make sure to include who the quote is from, and even if that's a musical artist or something like that. You can see how we have one size that's being used, one font, one different, obviously one different font within that typeface here. But we're really playing with the spacing here within these individual words of this quote, which is kind of being called out to create that sense of emphasis. We're using a different amount of spacing within the leading as well as the tracking here, which really emphasizes that, and then actually creating that nice white space within the actual layout of the composition itself to emphasize that even further. Now in the second layout here, we're able to start utilizing some different sizing, and we're also able to use the same, or I should say one typeface, but we're able to use variations of fonts within that typeface. I believe it's up to 3. So we can see that now we're introducing some italic versions, some bolder versions, so on and so forth here. And we're also really starting to explore within the variation of this quote, some ways to express the meaning of each one of these words here, the way that they're playing with leaps and kind of moving the different individual letter forms and altering them and rotating them and so on and so forth. And number 3, now we're really pushing with the scale here a little bit further, right? Still falling back on those same type formatting tools we used in the first one. You'll see that there's very large amount of tracking here and also very large leading, a lot of spacing that's going on. And then over here, there's very, very tight leading that's going on. The letter forms are kind of stacked right on top of each other. And then of course, the use of scale is getting much stronger here as well as a alignment within your composition. And then lastly, you're kind of throwing it all together. Now you're able to use the different typefaces. You're able to, I think it's 2 different typefaces, any styles within them, whether it's bold, italic, condensed, extended, so on and so forth. You're able to use any sizing, and you can really start to play with that overall composition. So when you do get into this 4th layout down here and you're introducing multiple typefaces together, I would suggest that you find typefaces that contrast one another. And one of the best ways to do that, to practice with in this particular one, is to choose a serif typeface and a sans serif typeface to create that contrast. We can see that being done here, where we have this sans serif typeface for magic and intuition, and then faith and the ampersand, and even the stuff up here are this serif typeface. In this case, it's kind of a slab serif typeface is what we refer to this, more of a display typeface. But we can see a big contrast between the different letter forms here that are being used. So make sure when you're introducing that new typeface that you're introducing a typeface that's going to have good contrast to the other choice. And that one of the easiest ways to do that is to choose a serif and a sans serif, at least in the beginning here, to kind of experiment with that. Okay. So that's there for you guys to check out. I think that kind of helps to see what it is that we're trying to do here. And then in association with the assignment sheet, you guys can look at the different layouts and rules applied there. Are there any questions on that right now? Does that make sense to you guys? Okay. I do have the, thank you, Frida. I do have the links down here for Adobe fonts. So let's just take a quick look at those. I'll click on the first one. This is going to take you to a Adobe fonts, essentially, which, as we know, we have access to within our Adobe subscriptions. And within the Adobe fonts, there are a few of these sort of font packs that they call them. This one here is going to be Design Foundations, curated by Natasha Jen. So it has multiple fonts here, actually, that you can look at to use for this. And then you can also dive into the actual family. So remember, this is a great example here. Let's look at this. Yeah, let's look at this one here. This ITV Avant-Garde Gothic Pro book. So this is actually a font, right? This is a specific version of this typeface. It's Gothic Pro book, which essentially means regular. It's a standard weight for that. You could certainly use this for this assignment. Once you get into those different layouts where you might want to expand on the variations within this typeface of Avant-Garde Gothic, you can click into that view family. And this is where you'll see that there's actually 3 different fonts, 3 different sort of variations within this typeface of Avant-Garde, right? We have Avant-Garde Pro Book, which we saw in the previous. We also have Pro Medium and Pro Bold. So once you get into those layouts that you're able to use the different fonts within that typeface, you can click into these and activate any of these that you would like. And once you activate these, you're able to use those within the design programs that we have. And that goes for any of these. So if you wanted to Futura, for example, here we have Futura Book, which is just one font within the family or typeface of Futura. Futura actually has 22 fonts within it. So we have Futura as the typeface, and then Book and Oblique as the fonts. We have Heavy down here, Condensed, which is going to have a much different look and feel to it, right? You're going to be able to fit a lot more words into a smaller area, which could be helpful sometimes. So this is what we're going to utilize for this practice. There's that first font pack there. And there's also this additional third party here, which I just included that you can also use for this assignment. These are a little bit more display fonts. And these are all typefaces that are founded on Adobe fonts, but this is kind of just an article that's a write-up about some of these kind of cool typefaces that are available. You're more than welcome to use any of these ones as well. There's, again, some that are a little bit more stylistic that kind of work well for headers, display fonts, so on and so forth. I love this belly display typeface here. I've used that for designs and stuff like that in the past. It has that really nice, eloquent serif look to it with those big pieces of contrast, right? Thick and thin within those letter forms. Again, not something you probably want to rely on for a lot of body copy, but for a display font or something larger can work pretty well. And that, again, kind of goes for a lot of these. So you guys can have some fun with any of these that you would like. And again, when you click on these, it'll take you to them in Adobe fonts. So you can just activate it right there in your Adobe font and be able to utilize those within the assignment. All right. Any questions on that right now? What you guys want to go over? Okay, why don't we do this? Let's take a break. Stop sharing here for a second. And I do have one additional lecture that I want to go over, which sort of covers, again, a little bit more of the styles of some of these typefaces and gets into that. But let's take a breather and then we'll come back in here and finish that off. Let's meet back here at 9:32. I'll give you guys about 10 minutes. And then I'll take roll and we'll finish up that lecture and go over the practice. Okay. I'll catch you guys back here at 9:32.